cents a gallon, and the car he was driving got 26 miles to the gallon. Then Vlad glanced at the words scrawled at the bottom of the last page. He gasped. "I know your secret," Mr. Otis had written. "I know you're a vampire." Vlad almost jumped out of his skin when a hand touched his shoulder. He turned to face Mr. Otis. "I must speak with you in private, Vlad." Vlad did the same thing he'd done in the 6th grade when Nellie asked him who had broken Mr. Snellgrove's window. He denied any knowledge pertaining to current events. "Look, if this is about the punctuation test." Mr. Otis held up a hand and hissed, "You know what it's about. We're going for a little walk, you and me." Mr. Otis's stern brow furrowed. "Excuse me, sense a breath escaping from his teacher's mouth. Vlad glanced at the leather-bound book, which was lying on the coffee table where he'd left it. Otis followed his gaze and, in a few steps, snapped the book up in his hands. How much of this have you read? Vlad shook his head, professing ignorance of the book's contents. I haven't read a word. It's written in some weird language. He shrugged and offered, I'm not even sure it is a language. Mr. Otis blinked and then blinked again. He looked at the book in his hands and back at Vlad. Clutching the book to his chest, he resumed his pacing across the room. Your father never taught you Elysian code, the vampiric language, he asked. Vlad pursed his lips stubbornly. How did you know, my father? Mr. Otis's booming voice reverberated in the room. Did he teach you the code? I have no idea what you're talking about. Vlad looked at Nellie, who shook her head, indicating she was clueless as well. It didn't surprise him that she was. His dad had been pretty secretive about the vampire world. Apparently very secretive. He dropped his eyes to the book in Mr. Otis's hands. Mr. Otis loosened his grip on the book. So you don't know. He lowered his voice so that Vlad had to strain to hear him. Did Thomas ever speak of Alysia, the vampire world? Vlad shot Mr. Otis a glare, and suddenly a wave of hunger washed over him. He could see himself biting into his teacher's neck, popping the skin between his teeth like a berry until the juices flowed down his throat and filled his belly. He wanted to taste Mr. Otis's blood, and he was starting not to care that he'd been injuring another person. He squeezed his eyes shut and then opened them again, once more under control. Mr. Otis might be a monster, but Vlad was nothing like him. Why are you asking me so many questions? I don't know anything, just let us go. He glared again, but Mr. Otis was no longer looking at him. Mr. Otis's eyes were kind of glazed, and he was regarding the space between Vlad's feet with growing interest. I can see it in your thoughts, like watching a short film. He told you about Alysia, but as bedtime stories, fairy tales, and he told you so little. He left out most of it, even the name, leaving you with false images embedded in your imagination. Otis shook his head, raising his gaze to meet Vlad's. The journal. Otis stretched his mouth wide, exposing his fangs and eliciting a gasp from Nellie. Your father was an outlaw, Vlad. He left Alysia for the love of your mother. Revealing vampiric heritage to humans is forbidden, let alone engaging in a romance with one. Those who do are hunted down, and their lives are taken for their crimes. Though he fought it, a tear dripped from the corner of Vlad's eye and rolled down his cheek. He didn't want to cry. Not here, in front of his parents' murderer. Not here when he was about to die. He tried to look away from Otis's fangs, but they gleamed in the soft light, demanding to be seen. Beside him, Nellie was shaking in her seat, muttering things that Vlad couldn't understand. He met Mr. Otis's eyes. So, that's why you killed my parents. But why did you kill Mr. Craig? And why kill us? We haven't broken any of your laws. Mr. Otis stopped, as if Vlad had kicked him hard in the chest. Is that what you think? No, Vlad, I wouldn't kill you. I could never bring myself to harm a family member. Otis's fangs shrank slightly. He regarded Vlad with shimmering eyes. Vladimir, I'm Thomas's half-brother, your uncle. Technically half-uncle. What? Vlad blinked again, trying to make some kind of sense out of the words his teacher had spoken, but he couldn't. What Mr. Otis had said was crazy. Nellie glanced nervously between Vlad Mr. Otis looked at Nellie and then at Vlad, stretching out his palms in front of him as if he were pleading for forgiveness. I'm sorry. It wasn't my intent to frighten you. I needed you to sit and listen. Every time I tried to talk to you, you'd run away. I need you to tell me what you know about Thomas and Melina, and exactly what happened to both of them. He glanced out the window again and then took a seat on the sofa, his elbows on his knees, his fingers raking back the hair from his face. I was shocked to hear of their deaths. In fact, after Mr. Craig disappeared, I volunteered to take this teaching spot to find you, Vlad. I thought if I found you, I could find Thomas. I never planned to harm you or your parents. I only hoped to protect you from the vengeful justice of Alysia. Tears coated his cheeks, and the sight of them made Vlad feel insignificant and small. The man he thought a monster was braver. The man he thought a monster was braver than he was. Brave enough to cry. Nellie stood and crossed the room, placing a caring hand on Mr. Otis's shoulder. We don't know what happened. It was an accident after their death, a dark mystery to us all. Vlad swallowed a lump in his throat and pushed the image of his parents to the back of his mind. Where is Alysia? A sigh escaped. All around you. Alysia isn't a place one can visit, Vlad. It's what we call vampire society, coexisting with your own world. That is Alysia. The council gathers in Stokerton. He tapped the book's cover and handed it back to Vlad. Everything you need to know is in here. I can teach you the code if you'd like, but later, when things are safer for you. His eyes shifted to the door, as if something terrible were going to burst through it at any second. Vlad gripped the book in both hands. A million questions cluttered his mind. But your hat, and that symbol. I need you to trust me, Vladimir. I loved your father. We were more than brothers. We were best friends. It pained me when he left, when he chose your mother over Alysia, but it was his choice to make, and I respected that. He pulled up his sleeve and held his wrist up for them to see. Vlad cringed a bit at the symbol, a guilty cringe, one from a boy who'd actually accused his uncle of being a murderer. When Otis turned his wrist, the symbol glowed slightly, like the glyph he and Henry had discovered in his father's study, like the one on the book he was holding. This is my symbol, my name in Elysian code. When a vampire vows to protect someone, we leave our symbol on something that belongs to them. It's called marking, and it serves as a warning to others that should they harm this person, they should expect harm returned to them by the one who did the marking. Vampires are honor-bound. If we bother to mark someone, it is taken quite seriously. Your father marked Mr. Craig as a vow to protect him by carving his name on his porch, just as surely as I marked you by carving mine on the box in your dresser. Unfortunately, someone ignored your father's mark. Who did kill Mr. Craig? Nellie blurted. Diablo, though I'm not sure why. He could have fed on any number of Bathory citizens. Did, in fact, on a young woman. But why he chose a man who'd been marked by your father is beyond me. Perhaps he'd hoped to anger Thomas, bring him out of hiding, which is where all of Alysia believes him to guess his concerns were being ignored. Stretching his thoughts downstairs, he pushed into Nellie's mind, but found only a haze of images and general confusion. Coming back to himself, Vlad looked at Otis. Are you clouding her thoughts? Otis frowned in irritation. I'm making her believe she knows nothing about you or me. It'll protect her from Diablo. Now hush. Suddenly Otis opened his eyes wide and looked at Vlad. He's taken her. The meaning of his words hadn't settled in Vlad's mind before Otis was down the stairs running toward the front door. Vlad bolted after him, calling to his aunt. When he reached the door, he found Otis slumped against the door jamb, looking out into the darkness. Vlad swallowed hard. Where is she? He's taken her to Alysia, no doubt as bait for you. As the anger boiled up within him, Vlad felt his fangs tear through the gums, pushing out the full length in a matter of seconds. He looked past Otis to the darkness outside. His heart rammed up against his ribs. Come on, he shouldered past Otis and moved down the sidewalk, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of Diablo and Nellie. Otis approached and placed a calm hand on his shoulder. Where do you think you're going? To Alysia. We're going to save my aunt. A look of terrible concern crossed Otis's face. Vladimir, that's exactly what he wants. Vlad looked out into the night, determination in his eyes. Then let's give it to him. Chapter 14. Alysia. Alysia. Otis smirked, but with a glare from Vlad, he stopped. If you're serious, we'll go. Have you mastered your anamorphing capabilities yet? The young vampire answered this question the only way he could, with a blank stare. Otis sighed. Okay, so flying's out. We'll have to drive, but we'll need a judge to watch the car. Do you have one? Vlad blinked again, and in his confusion, his fangs began to shrink. A what? A drudge. Otis waited for a spark of recognition in Vlad's eyes, but when he didn't see it, he sighed again in frustration. Do you have a human who you can control, who you can make do your bidding, follow your will with little effort? Vlad bit his bottom lip, not realizing his fangs were still protruding some, and licked away the blood quickly. Well, I guess that would be Henry. He was pretty sure Henry wouldn't be amused at being referred to as a vampire's human slave, but he was the first person who came to mind. Vlad scratched his head and his fangs retreated fully, but he doesn't really do everything I ask him to. Otis raised an eyebrow. Do you ask him, or do you tell him? Vlad blinked, wondering just what Otis was driving at. He's my friend. I ask him. Next time, tell him. Drudges have no will to resist their masters. Call him now. Tell him to meet us at my car in an hour. Otis looked determined, almost hungry. The sight of it gave Vlad a shiver. Why can't we leave now? Otis turned to walk down the sidewalk, and Vlad had to jog a bit to catch up. Because we've got to feed. Vlad slowed his steps. The freezer stocked. Where are you going? snack packs Vlad knew he'd seen. Vlad narrowed his eyes. "Watch me," he told Otis. He turned and walked back to the house. At first, he didn't hear Otis behind him, and he half expected that Otis would run off after the jogger. But then his footsteps were echoing Vlad's. Vlad smiled triumphantly. They dined on bagged blood. An hour after Vlad rang Henry on his cell phone, Henry walked up to the open front door and greeted Vlad with a concerned glance. "What's going on? Why is Mr. Otis in your driveway?" Otis was placing Vlad's backpack full of blood bags he'd insisted they'd need into the back of his car. He looked up at Henry. "Come here, Drudge. Help me get the car ready, and we'll get going." Vlad cringed. Henry threw Vlad a glance. "What did he just call me?" "Never mind. I'll explain everything later. Just go help him, will you? Somebody took my aunt. We've got to go save her." Henry nodded. There were questions in his eyes, but he ran over and helped Otis with the car. Vlad smirked. Maybe there was something to this Drudge thing after all. He had noticed that his school books seemed to be getting heavier as the years went on. Plus, there were the mounds of homework to consider. They piled into the car, Henry in the back, Vlad in the front, Otis in the driver's seat. As they started out of town, Vlad looked at Otis and cleared his throat. "So, you came to Bathory to protect my father, not to bring him back to Alysia." Otis gave Vlad a brief smile, then focused again on the road. "Yes, Vlad. The council supported my efforts. As I'm likely the only person your father would have surrendered to. Of course, they didn't know I came to warn him, not ensnare him." "How do we get there?" Vlad asked. "To Alysia, I mean." To his amazement, he could already hear Henry snoring in the back seat. The guy could fall asleep on a car trip to the mailbox. The dashboard lights cast a cool blue on Otis's face. He was watching the road intently. "Have you noticed that his history? The history books make no mention of whose idea it was to build cities, Vlad. They theorize, yes, and place the Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans at the center of their theories. But historians really don't know who came up with the design for metropolitan areas. Not human historians, anyway." Vlad raised an eyebrow. "Are you saying vampires invented cities?" "Quite. What better place for a superior race to hide than at the heart of an enormous population, where buildings are always busy despite the time of day? Where large numbers of people live in a relatively small area, and a dead body is discounted as just another suspicious, okay? Henry nodded and settled back in his seat, the small squirt gun clutched against his chest. He looked like a romper room Rambo, waiting to take on the world. Vlad got out and followed Otis to the revolving doors. Won't they know we're coming if we use the front door? They already know we're here, Vlad. Otis stepped through the door with a glance behind him at the car. Vlad had never felt so scared in his life. The elevator smelled like a weird mixture of cinnamon buns and moldy carpet. An older gentleman and a woman in a dark blue business suit with her hair in a tight bun entered after Vlad and Otis. Otis merely smiled at them as he glanced at the panel of number buttons. The elevator shifted, carrying them up several floors before it stopped and the man exited. Otis leaned past the woman with a flirtatious glance that said, "Allow me." Hidden in the wood next to the panel was a glyph, which he touched, inciting it to glow brightly. Otis's eyes didn't change colors. The panel of buttons slid down, revealing another set of buttons. Otis pressed lobby, and the woman pressed 4. The elevator began its descent, and when they reached the 4th floor, the strange woman got out without a word. Otis leaned back on the handrail. "Not what you expected, is it?" "I was thinking something with bats and an ominous moon floating above." Otis raised his eyebrows and chuckled. The elevator door opened into a posh lobby with a well-polished marble floor, black leather sofas, and a large grandfather clock against the far wall. Vlad followed Otis to the front desk, and after Otis had a brief mumbled conversation with the receptionist, they settled on one of the sofas and waited. For what? Vlad couldn't be sure. The Muzak version of Who Let the Dogs Out was pouring out of unseen speakers around them. Vlad rubbed his temples, trying to block out the sound. "Doesn't this strike you as a bit too corporate?" Otis folded his hands on his lap and tilted his head to the side. "What do you mean?" Vlad flashed him an incredulous look, but Otis didn't react to it. "I mean, doesn't it seem just a little bit strange that we whisk off in the night to a world where vampires are the norm, only to end up in an office lobby drumming our fingers?" Otis blinked at him, clearly not getting Vlad's point. Vlad sank in his seat and crossed his arms in front of him. "Never mind, it's just weird, is all." "I think you've seen too many movies, Vlad." The curvaceous redhead behind the desk stood and nodded to Otis. "Mr. Otis, you can go in now." She sat down again, but not before giving Vlad a wink. Otis stood and brushed invisible dust from his slacks before gesturing to the large double doors to the left of the receptionist's desk. "Shall we, Vlad?" Vlad was quite sure they wouldn't. They shouldn't, but he stood anyway and walked through the double doors. Behind the doors was a significantly darker, more appropriately ominous room. Large silk rugs covered the floor, and tall, thin windows marked their passage across the length of the room, toward the table at the other end. 6 men and 3 women sat facing the door, with nothing but the polished black table between them and Vlad. Behind them was an oversized, glossy black fireplace. Otis grabbed Vlad's arm and pulled him toward the gathered group. His fingers pressed brutally into Vlad's skin as he flung Vlad forward. Vlad stumbled and fell to the floor. He flashed Otis a confused glance. Otis straightened his shoulders proudly. "As requested, counsel. I've brought you the son of Thomas Tod." Tall vampire at the center met Vlad's eyes. Vlad instantly recognized him as the man in black, Diablo. Otis had called him. "We are indeed grateful for your efforts, Otis, even though the results took what seemed like ages to come by." "My apologies, Mr. President. It took longer than expected to locate the boy, and I had to be certain he was Thomas's son before bringing him in. I'd hoped to locate Thomas first, to please the council with an unexpected end to our hunt, but the boy is clever." Otis dropped his eyes to Vlad and shook his head. "Too much like his father. I fear locating Thomas will take even longer." Vlad looked up at Otis, frozen to his spot on the floor. What was Otis talking about? Thomas was dead. He knew that. Diablo slid a small stack of legs felt like jello. He cast another glance at his uncle, this one full of trepidation. Otis. But Otis wasn't looking at him. His eyes were fixed on Diablo. Vlad watched in horror as the corners of Otis's mouth lifted in a smile. Vlad grabbed Otis's sleeve, but was shaken off. What? No. You're my uncle. You're supposed to help me. Arms appeared from nowhere and grabbed Vlad's shoulders, holding him still. Otis turned back to the double doors without so much as a glance at Vlad. Vlad fought against the guards as hard as he could. He wrenched his shoulders away, but the guards grabbed his arms and picked him up off the floor. Vlad's eyes flashed in hatred and his fangs nearly jumped from his gums. Otis, what's wrong with you? How could you do this? The cry caused Otis to pause. He turned to Vlad and moved closer, his lip curled in a snarl. Vladimir, how could I not? This is my home, my family. You were nothing more than a mistake my brother made. Hot tears streamed down Vlad's cheeks. He lowered his voice, hoping that the man he thought Otis was, the man he wanted very much for him to be, would hear him and end this madness. Don't hurt her, Otis. Don't hurt Nellie. Otis parted his lips, revealing shimmering fangs, and turned back to the door. In 10 steps, he was gone, a betrayer about to turn murderer. Diablo cleared his throat. Vladimir Tod, I've been looking for you for a long time. You're not an easy person to find, but I imagine you're well aware of that. Vlad's chest shook with every beat of his heart. He stared at the door, willing Otis to return and make things right again, but the doorknob stayed horrifically still. Especially when you're being helped. Now, who has been assisting you in hiding from Alysia, young one? Vlad dried his eyes on his sleeve. He needed time. Time to figure out what he was going to do. When he spoke, his voice cracked. No one, and I wasn't hiding. I didn't even know you guys existed until recently. Diablo shook his head slowly in disbelief, a smirk on his lips. Surely you knew there were other vampires. Vlad counted the vampires. There were 13, including the guards. He might be able to wriggle away from the 2 that were holding him and outrun the rest. But what then? The most his flitting mind could think of involved scenarios not so unlike the Scooby-Doo mysteries. No, I didn't. Up until a few weeks ago, I thought I was the only one left. Diablo rounded the table. He clutched at Vlad's jaw with his gloved hand, examining his face intently. You look as I expect your father looked when he was a boy. Same eyes, hair, yes. I suspect you'd age to look strikingly similar to Thomas. Diablo turned back to the table, his voice deep and clear. If left unpunished, you would surely follow in your father's crime-shadowed footsteps. Vlad shook his head. Punished, but I haven't done anything. Diablo's eyes flashed in irritation. Your father is an ingenious man, young Vladimir, having successfully remained hidden from this council for some 14 years. Give us his location and you may live. Where is Thomas Tod? Vlad pressed his lips together, refusing to meet his questioner's gaze. Inside his head he felt a gentle nudge and relaxed his mouth. The vampire asked again, his voice smooth and coaxing. Where is Thomas Tod? Vlad could hear another sound. Another sound in the room. It resembled his voice so closely, but he couldn't recall having parted his lips to speak. Still, the voice said, he's dead. The vampire nodded before conferring quietly with his peers. Coming to some sort of conclusion, marked by nods and mumbles, the council collectively waved Vlad away. The guard squeezed his arms tightly and pulled him toward another set of double doors. Vlad felt the temporary calm that had Otis would kill him. The spray he handed Henry wasn't garlic at all. It was likely just water, and poor Henry had been duped as well. Because of Vlad, those closest to him would be made to suffer. Otis led him down a long, dark hallway. Near the end were 3 cells with bars like those Vlad had seen on the cop shows Nellie watched on Thursday nights. But there would be no more cop shows for Nellie, no more late-night talks, no more snack packs or tea. There would be no more hugs that he pretended to loathe, no conversations he faked being bored with, no more Nellie. Otis slid open the door to the cell and nudged Vlad inside. The floor of the cell was covered in yellow hay, as if the area were intended for livestock. Vlad shivered, picturing Nellie in the small space. Otis slid the door closed, locking them in the cell together. He circled the room, surveying the floor and the walls. He turned to Vlad, a look of hunger on his face. His voice was no more than a rough whisper. "You have no idea what's going on here, Vladimir." "No, I think I do." The tears threatened to return, but Vlad cursed them and tried hard to steady his shaking hands. Otis had begun pacing back and forth, like an animal ready to attack. "I know what it must look like, but things had to go this way. I had no choice." "You have a choice now. Don't kill me, Otis." Vlad met Otis's eyes. "Please." Otis grabbed Vlad by the shoulder and shook him once hard. "Don't you understand? If the council wants you dead, they won't stop until they know that you are. There is only one way for either of us to get out of here alive." Vlad shuddered, realizing that his words were in vain. There was no way to talk his uncle out of doing what he had planned to do from the beginning. He dropped his eyes to the ground. He wasn't about to let Otis see him cry again. In the corner of the cell was a square, a metal plate set into the floor. Caught on its edge was a single scrap of fabric. The pattern matched the shirt Nellie had been wearing when Vlad had last seen her. Despite his bitter anger toward Otis, Vlad pointed to the plate. "What's that?" "It's a disposal chute. After prisoners are dealt with, their bodies are deposited in there. It leads to the incinerator." A look of shame washed over him. Vlad straightened to his shoulders. The floor at his feet was dotted with fresh blood. Nellie's blood. The thought of it made him wrench. "How could you, Otis? How could you do that to Nellie? How can you do it to me?" The color bled from Otis's face. He lifted Vlad's backpack and unzipped it, revealing the bags of blood inside. 3 of the bags were empty. Otis's face was blank as he pointed to the floor. "That isn't Nellie's blood, Vladimir. I'm on your side." Vlad blinked. "I'm getting really tired of these guessing games, Otis. What exactly is going on here?" Otis lowered his voice and stepped closer. Vlad tried not to budge, but he took a step back in spite of his intentions. Otis frowned. "Nellie is outside in the car. I came back for you. The blood was just to convince the rest of Alysia I'd killed her." Vlad looked at the empty blood bags and then over his shoulder. "What about handing me over to those thugs and saying those horrible things?" Otis slipped 2 of the bags from Vlad's backpack and bit them open. He handed the backpack to Vlad and began squirting more blood onto the floor. "I apologize for that. It was merely a ruse to buy me enough time to save your aunt, and you." "A ruse? They could have killed me." Vlad slipped on the slick floor, but caught his balance before he fell. "What about Henry?" Otis gave the bags a final squeeze before tossing them back into the backpack and zipping it closed. "He's fine, but we better hurry. Diablo doesn't trust me fully. That's why he came to Bathory to gather you himself." He crossed the room and lifted the big metal plate, casting Vlad an expectant glance. "Get in." Vlad raised an eyebrow. "I don't think so. It seems Diablo and I have something in common. I don't trust you either." He shrugged and slung the backpack over his shoulder. "Call me cynical. We don't really have time to discuss this right now." Otis climbed into the hole and slid down the chute. Vlad didn't spend much time weighing his options. If he stayed, the vampires of Alysia would most certainly kill him. Jumping into an incinerator after the madman who might have just killed his aunt wasn't much of a chance. Otis opened a round hatch at the end and moonlight poured into the small passage. Thomas and I dug this tunnel before he left Alysia, back when he was vice president of the council. Vlad slid out behind Otis, his feet once again on firm pavement. Otis was looking around for the car. He was a good man, your father. Henry was standing at the opening to an alley, waving his arms. Vlad ran toward him, and Henry looked over his shoulder at the nearby car. Nellie was leaning against it, looking scared and shaken, but alive. Vlad slowed as he passed Henry, who gave his arm a light punch and approached Nellie with a relieved sigh. He couldn't bear losing Nellie, not after losing his parents. She was more than his guardian. She was his friend, his family. Nellie made everything alright, and if she were gone, nothing would ever be alright again. She managed to smile before he wrapped his arms around her. Vlad's chest grew heavy, his eyes welled with tears. He'd almost lost her. He'd almost been orphaned, again. Nellie kissed his brow repeatedly, and Vlad welcomed it. Silently, he vowed that he would protect her from harm for as long as blood coursed through his fangs. Cold, quiet laughter filled the alley. Well now, isn't this sweet? Vlad turned to see Diablo, who was backed by 4 large bodyguards. Diablo sneered. Did you think it would be so easy to escape your father's past, boy? Do you think I was blind to Otis's feeble attempts to keep me from you? He tossed off his black overcoat, and it fell to the pavement. Otis glanced at Nellie, who ushered Henry into the car. She reached for Vlad's shoulder, but Vlad shook her off. Diablo took a single step forward, his eyes locked with Vlad's. Otis stepped between them. We cannot hold the boy accountable for his father's crimes. It is I who lead this council, Otis. Therefore, I will decide his fate. Diablo nodded to one of his guards, and the man swaggered over and grabbed Otis by the arm. Otis wriggled uselessly, his face reddened in anger. I won't let him harm you. I won't let you harm him. Miraculously, Otis shoved the brute aside and broke into a run toward Diablo. Time slowed to a crawl as his feet slapped the pavement. Diablo watched his approach with an amused glint in his eye. When Otis was merely feet from him, Diablo swung his arm and slapped Otis in the face with such force that Vlad thought he could hear the bones crack. Otis tumbled into the arms of the waiting bodyguards. They dropped him to the ground and pinned him. Vlad was left to face Diablo alone. Vlad looked from his wounded uncle to Diablo. His heart began a strong, steady pounding. Diablo's stern jaw relaxed some as he turned to face Vlad, and the corner of his mouth arose in a smirk. Vlad wondered if Diablo had been smirking when he killed his parents. Vlad's mouth tightened. Tears threatened to well up in his eyes, but the sight of Diablo's clenching fists kept them at bay. Not only was Vlad facing his parents' killer, he was likely facing his own. Vlad swallowed hard and straightened his shoulders, trying to look intimidating. His lower lip trembled slightly, betraying his fear. He swore, and he met Diablo's cold eyes. Diablo smoothed his shiny black leather gloves onto his hands and smiled triumphantly. Now, Vladimir, do you have any final words before I carry out your sentence? Vlad didn't move. He could barely breathe, but he'd spent most of his 8th grade year running from bullies. He was tired of it. My father wrote about Alysia. He said it was a place of brotherhood and camaraderie. Vlad slanted in his eyes. Camaraderie, Vlad slanted in his eyes. He never mentioned it was full of egotistical jerks in bad suits. Diablo paused. His posture hadn't changed at all, but he was no longer smiling. His fangs gleamed in the moonlight. Being raised away from Alysia has robbed you of an important lesson in respect and in fear, young Vladimir. He stepped closer. Diablo couldn't have been more wrong. Vlad was afraid. With every step Diablo took, Vlad felt his heartbeat quicken. His pulse raced along with his thoughts, but he wasn't about to show Diablo his fear. If his dealings with Bill and Tom had taught him anything, it was this: never let them see you sweat. Vlad resisted the urge to flee and said, "Oh, give it up. Could you be more the smooth tube to Diablo. Diablo couldn't possibly be afraid of it, could he? He was nothing, really. It was nothing, really, just a trinket that had belonged to Vlad's father. Probably about as dangerous as chapstick. Still, Vlad was ready to utilize any tool he could. He held it out toward Diablo, who stepped back again, far enough that Vlad wondered where he was going. The men who were holding Otis down were exchanging terrified whispers. "Where did you get that?" Diablo had stopped his retreat. He looked wearily from Vlad to the object in his hand. Vlad feigned both knowledge of the tool and the confidence that he could use it. "It was a gift from my father before he died." The brutes had apparently reached the conclusion that Diablo wasn't worth dying for, as they released their hold on Otis and hurried back inside. Otis stood and brushed the grime of the alley from his clothes, but he didn't speak, and Vlad noted with interest Otis didn't move any closer. Diablo forced a smile. "It's a fascinating instrument. May I have a closer look?" Vlad pointed the tube at Diablo as he rose to his feet. His ribs screamed and his voice shook. "Stay back." As if a light had gone over his head, Diablo relaxed visibly. "Or you'll what, Vlad? A real vampire wouldn't point a Lucius at another without the full intention of using it. So are you merely threatening me until you can figure out how to use it, or do you understand the power that you now hold in your hands?" He stepped closer, his fangs long and fierce. Hunger flicked in his eyes. Vlad tore his frightened gaze away from Diablo. His breaths came in shaking gasps. His fingers trembled against the cylinder. The end facing him bore the symbol that mirrored his father's tattoo, so like the symbol on the cover of the book. Diablo broke into a sure stride. Saliva glistened on the tips of his exposed fangs. Vlad pushed the sound of Diablo's approach out of his head. He thought of the book, of the panel at the back of his dad's suit closet. They both had the glyph, and when he touched it, Diablo threw his head back and opened his mouth as wide as he could. When he touched it, the glyph had slowed, but not for Henry. It was a vampire shield, something to prevent humans from opening vampiric items, and if this thing had a glyph too. Diablo lunged forward, spittle dripping from his mouth. A low, hungry, guttural cry left his lungs as he descended on Vlad. Vlad looked at Otis, who nodded, understanding Vlad's thoughts without the use of telepathy. Vlad ran his thumb across the glyph. It glowed brightly, and the cylinder shook his hands. He held it tightly. A piercing white light shot from the opposite end, filling the alley with a blinding flash. Vlad squeezed his eyes shut and ran his thumb over the glyph once more. When he opened his eyes again, the light had faded, contained once more within the small black cylinder. Diablo lay on the ground, clutching his stomach. Well, clutching where his stomach should have been. Through the enormous hole in Diablo's torso, Vlad could see the dark, moist pavement on the other side. Diablo looked up at him with flickering eyes and forced a laugh. "You think you've won? You think you've defeated me?" Vlad tightened his grip on the tube, but stopped when Otis grabbed his arm. "It's over, Vlad. Leave him here to die." Vlad knelt. His face was mere inches from Diablo's. "That was for Mr. Craig, and for anyone else you've ever hurt." Diablo chuckled. Blood coated his lips. "Do you think it makes any difference, little one? Do you think it makes any difference, little one? There are thousands of vampires in the world doing the same as I have." Vlad held the Lucius up for Diablo to see. "Well, there's one fewer tonight." Diablo coughed, sending a spatter of blood across Vlad's cheek. And then he was still. On the drive home, as Henry snored beside him, Vlad allowed himself a few more tears. These for the father he knew so little about, and for the mother who'd never kiss him as Nellie had tonight, and for himself, because beneath the relief and general sense of well-being lurked something dark and disturbing. The knowledge that he would one day return to Alysia, that his father's journal would lead him there to seek answers to questions he had not yet asked. Otis was driving, and Nellie was in the passenger seat. The soft blue light from the radio illuminated the front seat, giving Vlad a clear view of their profiles. was too riled up to sleep and had no idea how Henry could. He was too riled up to sleep and had no idea how Henry could, so he stared out the window and counted stars as the lights of the city faded into blackness. All that was ahead of him was the twinkle of starlight and the comforting return home. Chapter 15. The End of a Dark Journey. Henry was sprawled across the couch in Vlad's living room, already asleep. Vlad tossed an old Afghan over him and joined Nellie and Otis in the dining room. Nellie looked weary, but relieved, and managed a smile. She pushed her teacup aside and got it from the table. "I'll be off to bed now, boys. My old bones just can't take the nightlife anymore." She kissed Vlad on the forehead, the way his mother used to. "Are you sure you're okay?" "I told you I'm fine." Vlad took a seat across from Otis. He winced as he sat, holding a hand to his injured rib. Nellie had given him and Otis pills for pain as soon as they got home, but Vlad hadn't kicked in yet. But his rib would heal in a few days and the pain would be but a memory. Vlad glanced at the steaming blood in his cup, raised it to his lips, and drank. Nellie nodded and retreated upstairs after a brief goodnight to Otis. Otis placed his cup in the saucer and cleared his throat. He looked at Vlad. "I've been searching for you for years. It's been a real pleasure getting to know you, Vlad." Why does that sound like a goodbye? He met Otis's eyes, the familiar feeling of loss already pricking his insides. "You can't just throw all this at me and then disappear. Besides, you're the only real family I've got." Otis shook his head. "I wouldn't say that. Nellie is a wonderful guardian." Vlad ran his finger thoughtfully over a knot in the wood of the table. Otis was right, of course, but it didn't stop Vlad from longing for something more concrete, for blood relations. Nellie was great, but she didn't know anything about being a vampire. "Why didn't you just tell me who you were when we first met?" Otis managed to smile. "Because I wasn't sure if you were a vampire or not. Since you had a human mother, I couldn't be sure that you had inherited that part of your father's being. You are the first of your kind, Vlad. You're also remarkably gifted at blocking telepathy. I wasn't sure if it was your gift as a vampire or a charm Thomas had given you that blocked my telepathy, so I had to use other means to find out, such as the oral report and the essay and the garlic." "Oh, and thanks for that." Vlad dunked a cookie into his cup and took a bite. "I spend my whole life trying to hide what I am, and you make me get up and tell the whole class." He gave Otis a grin, not awkward in the least. Otis stretched his arms over his head and yawned. Outside, the sky was turning pink. It was almost dawn. "I needed to know where Thomas was so I could warn him that Diablo and the rest of Alysia had learned he was in Bathory. I couldn't reveal myself to you if you were human. That's a crime." Otis glanced out the window, looking a little concerned. From his jacket, he pulled out a small tube and proceeded to rub sunblock on his skin. "But you told Nellie." "Yes, and I would likely be punished for it if Alysia were to find out." Otis finished coating his exposed skin and put the tube back in his pocket. Henry's snores drifted in from the living room. Then, after one loud snort, he was silent once again. Vlad lowered his voice so as not to wake Henry. "When we were in Alysia, you mentioned that my dad had been vice president of that council." "Yes. Well, that was a long time ago." Otis shifted in his seat as if the sunrise were making him restless. "So tell me about it." Vlad plucked another cookie from the plate on the table and nibbled. Otis yawned again. Vlad resisted following suit. "Thomas had been on the council for more than 100 years when I was turned from human into vampire, and for another 300 before he left Alysia to raise you." Vlad nearly choked on his cookie. "We live that long. Most of us, yes." Otis drew his arms up around himself as if the temperature had plummeted several degrees. "Will I live that long? I'm not sure, Vladimir. You're special." He shifted his eyes about the room as if checking to make sure they were alone. Vlad looked over his own shoulder for any unwanted presences. Otis's fidgeting was unsettling. "What do you mean?" Otis sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Vampires are made by sharing blood with a human and giving that human part of your essence. It's been this way since the beginning of time. But you," his Adam's apple popped as he swallowed hard. send someone else to look for my father and me. No. Otis smiled at Vlad reassuringly. I'm going to send word to the council that Thomas died in Bathory, and they now know you have the Lucius and are capable of using it. They won't come after you, Vlad. Otis, Vlad looked from his uncle to the hole in his shoe and back. If Diablo didn't kill my parents, do you know who did? Otis was quiet for a moment, then met Vlad's eyes. No, Vlad, I don't. Vlad nodded. He was deeply disappointed, but not surprised. He wondered if he would ever know. Otis, will you? He paused, trying to keep the doubt out of his voice. Will you teach me everything you can about being a vampire? There's no one else who can do it. Otis's eyes sparkled warmly. I would be honored to, Vlad. Vlad cleared his throat. He didn't trust himself to speak. Otis got up to check that Henry was still sleeping before turning back to Vlad. When school is over, I'll return to Alysia and go into hiding, but I'll always return for you, whenever you need me. Vlad hesitated, then blurted out, what if I said I needed you now, and that I need you to be around all the time? Otis was quiet for several minutes before rolling up his sleeve and exposing the tattoo on the inside of his wrist. It glowed slightly when he moved it closer to Vlad. Do you remember when I told you about my mark? This symbol that, in the vampiric language, is my name. Well, it's also my tie to Alysia, to all of the vampiric brotherhood. Whenever I am scared or alone or saddened by events that I cannot control, I touch it and I'm reminded that I am part of something very special. Vlad reached out slowly and brushed his fingers against the glyph. It brightened in response. A wave of sadness washed over him. The mark is normally given the day following a vampire's creation. Otis went just an old vampire legend, Vlad, about a boy who was born a vampire. Pay it no mind. With the rev of the engine, he drove off, leaving Vlad standing at the end of the driveway. The sky was bright pink and cold. Gold. Vlad watched Otis drive off into the sunrise, like some sort of vampire cowboy. It had been a long night, and he hadn't even finished his math homework. Vlad stepped back into the house and closed the door, quietly behind him. Henry was still sleeping on the couch. Nellie was no doubt nestled under her flower comforter upstairs. Vlad climbed the stairs, and after pausing to stroke Amendy's fur, he slipped into his bedroom, where he was greeted by the framed smiles of his mom and dad by his bed, the most welcoming sights he'd ever seen. Chapter 16. The Mark of a Vampire. Like a man who has wandered through shadowed forests seeking reprieve from their looming darkness and strange, creaking, haunting sounds, only to collapse in relief at his first glimpse of light, Vlad sat down heavily at his desk on his last day in 8th grade and surveyed the class around him. He wasn't exactly sure what the point of the last day of school was supposed to be, other than easing the summer janitor's duties by emptying the desks and lockers. Principal Snellgrove ensured that this task was done by making it a requirement in order to attend a Freedom Fest, an afternoon that began with the final game of the Bathory Pats, the high school's much-celebrated baseball team, and ended with the last dance of the year in the school gym. It should have been a happy day for Vlad. After all, he was finally leaving junior high, and next year was full of possibilities. Bill and Tom would be freshmen, too, and have to deal with bullies of their own. He and Henry would be high schoolers. And life would begin anew. But overshadowing what should have been a pleasant day was the knowledge that tonight Otis would be leaving, and though he'd reassured Vlad several times that he would return, his words hadn't lifted the deep, heavy, hollow feeling in Vlad's chest. A flash of pink caught Vlad's eye. Meredith was wearing a pretty pink sundress. Vlad managed to smile, and to his delight, she smiled back, her cheeks blushing before she looked away. Vlad looked away, too, but only long enough to glimpse the tattooed symbol on the inside of his wrist. Feeling a surge of confidence, he straightened in his seat, returning his gaze to Meredith once again. "Hey, Meredith." She looked at him, her blue eyes twinkling, and when she smiled again, Vlad felt like he was flying. "Hey, Vlad, how are you?" "I'm great." He cleared his throat and glanced around before meeting her eyes. "But I'd be better if you went to the Freedom Fest dance with me." Her lips parted, a glimpse of white porcelain as her smile spread into a grin. "I'd love to." Vlad's heart drummed out an elated beat, and as he uttered the most ridiculous thing possible, "Did I just say thank you?" he asked himself. Mr. Otis entered the room, ushering in the final stragglers so they could get down to the business of their last day. "Good morning, class. I'm afraid I have bad news." Otis dropped his bag on his chair and leaned against the desk. "After today, you are all finally free of my tyrannical grasp and now infamous pop quizzes. Pressing matters are taking me away from the town of Bathory, despite much pleading on the part of the school board. So after the game this afternoon, I'll bid you all a fond farewell. But never fear, it may be my last day here, but you are collectively beginning an exciting journey. I'm sure the coming years in Bathory High will prove far more fascinating than any one of my classroom hours." Otis smiled at his students, pausing for a moment with his eyes on Vlad. Outside the open door stood Henry, most likely on his way to the final student council meeting of the year. He'd already been elected president of the 9th grade, student council beginning the following term.